Hello, and welcome to the Four C's with Ken Johnson. So, this is the month of October, and we have been dealing with archetypes and allegory based off my award-winning book, A Quick Guide to Archetypes and Allegory. And this book talks about intentional writing using Jungian psychology and common iconic characters found in literature and their hidden meanings. So, this episode is all about werewolves. Now, werewolf is not something I really care about. I'm kind of unique, but a lot of guys gravitate to werewolves because whereas a vampire really talks about sexuality, especially female sexuality, werewolves talk about sexuality, specifically male sexuality. And so it's really neat from a culturalist perspective. And a culturalist, just so you know, I've got a few degrees. One of the degrees I have is in social sciences. And that's the reason why I study culture. Remember, I talked about 4 C's: conflict, culture, conservation, and commerce. So one of my other degrees, I have a degree in business. So that's the commerce. But as a culturalist, a social scientist that studies cultures, what I do is I like to look at literature. I like to look at what we call cultural relics. So I'll look at books, especially comic books, and try to understand things. And especially with comic books, the werewolf is very unique. So as Jung talks about, the werewolf is one that is about male sexuality, male development, male angst. And so when Jung came out with this, the federal government, being the wise overseers that they are, they decided that comic books were dangerous. Originally, comic books were funny. They were called funny books. That's where we get the word comic from in comic books. And then they started doing all these different characters. And so the federal government started banning stuff because anytime we don't understand stuff, first thing we do is we try to ban it. We try to get it out. We try to persecute it. And so this was one of the things they wanted to do was ban comic books. And so the comic book publishers got this bright idea, and you have to realize the era and time, it really was smart. It was stupid according to our time, but in their time it was brilliant. And what they did is they came up with this thing called the Comic Code Authority. And so the CCA was a way of vetting and making sure that the comics were safe enough to put in front of young children. And so in those rules, you could not have a werewolf. And why is that? Because the werewolf, according to Jungian psychology, one of the things it represents is pubescence. And you do not want a bunch of pubescent boys that relate to a werewolf doing werewolf things. And society, and especially American society, has always treated children with hostility. Adults fear children. It makes no sense, but they do. If you look at our history, we have always had a war on youth in America. And so this was a part of that long-running war on youth. And so the werewolf was not allowed. In fact, DC Comics had a guy by the last name of Wolfman, and just because that was his last name, and they banned anything they even referred to Wolf or Wolfman, he was not allowed to get any of his comics published just because of his last name. It was stupid according to our contemporary thoughts, but back then they had to be that way because you have to think of how rigid America was back then and how stupid it was. So what happened? Well, we have to go back further. So in Victorian times, we had a change. And so the Queen had decided that she was going to come up with this deal of basically ridding what we consider to be toxic masculinity today. Because there's a war against the genders, and it's been going on forever. And so whenever women are in power, men tend to be persecuted. So today we call it toxic masculinity. Over the course of history, anytime a woman's been in power, it's been called something else, but pretty much that's what it is. And so you had authors that had to change characters. The werewolf usually was associated with French literature. And so the French have always had an impact on others because they're more willing to look at concepts and ideas and turn it on its ear. Not saying they haven't done some barbaric stuff too, but the literature has always been impactful. And so you get some people that they came up with this idea of changing the werewolf. And so we get Jekyll and Hyde because they didn't want to do the werewolf because of the era and what it was talking about. And that was kind of persecuted in England. What they did is they took a French concept and said, we'll do Jekyll and Hyde. So Jekyll and Hyde was actually a change in the archetype for that era, and it was the same allegory. So you can do that as a writer. I bring this up because there's proof, if you look through the history, that you can change an archetype and it still be the same thing. And so we fast forward, we got the CCA, the Comic Code Authority, and the stories suck, and everybody knows the stories suck. And they're trying to reach these children, and they can't because the government says you can't do it, and the parents are all freaking out. The churches are threatening to burn stuff, and everybody's throwing a freaking hissy fit over nothing. And so they get this bright idea. Why don't we change the character? Why don't we instead do Jekyll and Hyde? And so in a previous discussion, I had said that I talked with superstar Ken Johnson, or Kenneth Johnson as he goes by. And Kenneth Johnson, he is the one that has done most of the movies that we remember in the 1980s. So if you think of the television show Battlestar Galactica, he wrote it. If you think of V, which V was an alien movie, that was him. And if you remember The Incredible Hulk, where Lou Ferrigno, which I got to meet Lou Ferrigno, he's an awesome guy, and but Kenneth Johnson wrote that, and he was I think he was the executive producer or something else too. He did a bunch of different stuff. And so when I talked to Kenneth Johnson about that, that's one of the things he brought up, that, oh, it was not werewolf, it was Jekyll and Hyde. But what we do know is Jekyll and Hyde is a werewolf. That is the werewolf archetype. So Marvel, they did use a character that was a werewolf, but they changed and took the Jekyll and Hyde approach to the werewolf, which a werewolf and Jekyll and Hyde have been synonymous for years by then. There was proof of it. And then because it was a green creature and he wasn't hairy, he was hulking and angry and frustrated, like a teenage boy, growing into himself and having two parts of his body, child and adult. And he'd get angry and get frustrated, hormones going everywhere, all these things that we can relate to as adults, knowing what it was like. Now they had a character, these teen pubescent boys, that they could gravitate to the Hulk. And then others followed suit, and you got all these other creatures, but none of them have ever done it as well as the Hulk, because the Hulk was as close to the true werewolf archetype and true allegory of the werewolf as any character has ever done in comic books. So the story of the werewolf has changed. And unfortunately, Marvel, what they did is in that last movie they did, where Bannister finally gets in touch with the Hulk and they become one, they totally wrecked the archetype. What it was, you had contemporary writers that were not doing thoughtful, meaningful writing. And so they created crap. And I'm telling you, Marvel, you created crap. You destroyed that archetype. And it had no allegory because your writers had no sense of purpose. They had no sense of the foundational understandings. But I digress. Instead, what we're going to talk about is the history of the werewolf. So, throughout all cultures in the world, we have had some sort of werewolf. Werewolf comes from a kind of a older version of English. If you think of English back in the old days, it was part German, part Scandinavian, part this, part that. And if you read the Old English, like I have, I can even speak some of it. It doesn't sound like English at all, not like we know it. And so, were means person or man. And so werewolf means man wolf. And so every single culture's had some type of what I call werekin, K-I-N. So in South America, the Native Americans down in South America, the indigenous peoples, they have a term. Basically, it was a were-possum. And they talk about these possums that would be the size of people. And other cultures, they have all these type of creatures that change from animal to man. In the original stories of werewolves, it was a way to explain why nature was attacking man. Because nature was considered to be the most like God, because God created nature, and so nature was the one that would actually listen to God better than mankind. And so whenever a wolf attacked, usually children, because back in those days, children were important because they were considered property. If you think of the old biblical understanding of children. They say children are like arrows in a quiver. And so they were assets of the male. And so even though women were losing their children to wolf attacks, it was considered to be an attack against the man. It was the man seed. It was this male-dominated culture. And so they would say it was witches, and it was the devil. And so the French, they especially gravitated towards the werewolf. And so that's where you got shape changers. They would have a wolf skin, and a witch would enchant this wolf skin, and a guy would put it on. And he would go and do the bidding of the devil. And then the witch, she was kind of like a bride to the devil. And that's the way it was done. So I say that to bring in, this is where we get in these YA books and YA films. so many are now gravitating to young women or young ladies because that's really the market. And they have the werewolf, and they have the vampire, and then they have the witch. And you wonder where that trilogy comes from. Well, it comes back from that old history. And so now, instead of being agents of the devil, the witch is an agent of nature, which is totally against what the history has been and the literature has been, but that is a contemporary version. And it's about female empowerment and connection with the earth. The vampire, we already discussed that. That is about female sexuality, and it's about these kind, caring guys that they are actually trying to allow the woman her sexuality, and he gives her power and he gives her freedom and all that garbage that is fantasy mostly. And then you got the werewolf. It is the jocks. It is the guy that's sprouting all this hair everywhere, and he's aggressive and he's having all these issues, but yet there's good in him, which goes against the literature as well, the historic literature, but it is allegory for a new time. And it is archetype being reinvented. And that's what authors and writers, we have the ability to do. So now anything with a duality to it can be a werewolf. It doesn't have to be an animal. It just has to be something you change into. Long gone are the days where a guy actually changes into a wolf. There's very few stories like that out there anymore. But if he does change into a wolf, it's a very weird wolf. It's not anything like a regular wolf, just behaving unusual. And so in these stories, you have basically a wolf man walking around, wreaking havoc, causing problems. It is a good way to talk about this idea of toxic masculinity. That is something to definitely address. As I mentioned earlier in another podcast, or not podcast, but another YouTube episode, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm going into fiction as well. And so I'm writing under my initials, K.L. Johnson. And so I'm doing a 1990s era paranormal. And I am using toxic femininity instead of toxic masculinity, and using the werewolf character in one of the chapters. So in mine, this guy sees multiple creatures. He is vanquishing multiple creatures, and each one of them will have a story. And so what I'm doing is I'm turning the story on its ear. And so I use two shape-shifting characters, very much akin to a werewolf. One is using toxic femininity, using toxic conservatism, and the other is actually toxic palynormia, I believe is what it's called, polyamory. Polyamory. So this guy is actually a polyamorous, and so I talk about the toxic elements of that. And so these two creatures are in battle. And so why do I bring this up? Because basically anything where there is a duality, where you see the person and then there's another element of that person that you don't see. This is a perfect archetype to do that with. In my book, I talk about Stephanie Osborne. She's a fantastic author. She's a NASA scientist, or former NASA scientist. She does all sorts of wonderful stories. And so she did this story called El Vengador. And so El Vengador is about this werewolf creature, Sasquatch, hairy character. And so all these Bigfoots and stuff of that nature that you see is actually in her story one. And it's actually talking about European conquest of Native American peoples. And it is a way to turn the allegory of the archetype on its ear. And it is the foundation of what good writing should be. So that's what I'm doing in these episodes. I'm hoping that the authors and writers of comics and different television, movie scripts, and books, and all sorts of storytelling, that they understand deliberate storytelling and the purpose behind it. Moreover, I want the readers to understand this. You owe it to yourself to reread and rewatch the shows, knowing what I'm talking about and trying to understand what the writer was trying to convey. Again, the reason, I've said this before, but the reason why I love fiction, in here, there is a device, there's a part of your brain that actually stops knowledge from coming in. It's a filter. In literature, fiction, literature, fictional storytelling of any type, because we have to imagine it, it's like turns a key and opens a door, or it just kind of actually goes around and circumnavigates the brain to a different area. And because of that, we become aware. We can take in knowledge that was banned from us. And so a lot of people say, books changed my life. These movies changed my life. Why did it? Because it made you think in a different way. So you were actually thinking totally different than you would if you were being told the hidden messages as fact. And because it was presented a different way, because it was presented as allegory, you considered it, you weighed it out, and then you changed your life accordingly. And that is the power behind writing. And so as a reader, you owe it to yourself to realize what that author was doing, what that screenwriter was doing, what they were saying and why, and how they did it. Because there's people that are unscrupulous. And you need to be aware of that as well. So I just hope you enjoy it. This brief little snippet on what a werewolf was about, where it came from. Now at this point in the episodes, I always talk about things that you can buy. So the first one, of course, I always do, my book. If you're a writer of any type, this is the book to buy. It is a very short, thin book. I have had one review, he said it is like a 500-word or 500-page text. He said that was invaluable. Another author, she said it was like a magic wand that she had forgotten she had. So I'm getting some great reviews on this, and people like it. And we got NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month coming up November 1st. So you owe it to yourself, if you're a writer, to write intentionally, write with purpose, and this book will help you do that. Additionally, my wife. I talk about my wife. I always dedicate my books to my wife. She astonishes me with her brilliance and creativity. And she has Tashana's Creations. And so Tashana's Creations is her way of doing fun things. She does what she loves, and she does it very well at an affordable price. So she creates t-shirts, hoodies, blankets, cooking pads, you name it. And she presses all these nice little sayings and things on there. She runs weekly deals. She's always changing her inventory. It's always fun. She has coffee mugs and tumblers that she can personalize with different graphics of all shapes and different things. She does some in 20 ounce and 30 ounce. for the tumblers, and those tumblers are like the 3-day and 2-day tumblers that you have your ice in there and you don't have to worry about it. So the difference between the tumblers she does and what you may find at some type of art place or Etsy or whatever, hers are not epoxy, and they're not done with that Cricut vinyl garbage. And so I bring that up because I've always hated this stuff. You can't put it in a dishwasher. It peels off. It cracks. You can't have it in sunlight. Everything you can't do with a tumbler that you do want to do, it just makes it impossible. And then the price. People paying up to $60 for a tumbler makes no sense to me. So if you go to her site, her tumblers and mugs are actually, it's impregnated into the tumbler. She has a special process she uses, and it's dishwasher safe. It is not clunky. It will not wear off. It is fantastic. And so the best part is it won't break the bank. So they make wonderful stocking stuffers. Another thing that I would recommend, if you're looking for unique gifts, my buddy Ricky Wallace. I've talked about him. Go to his YouTube channel, Wallace Knifeworks and Homestead. And like I've said, Ricky is country through and through, and he is one of the best persons I've ever known. He has all these imaginative, creative ideas that I would never think about. And with him, what you see is what you get. And that's a rare thing these days. But what I love about his gifts, like I said, I have a bunch of knives. This right here is actually the end of a deer tine. Has sinew wrapping. And he took some items that no one were ever going to use, and he made a functional neck knife. So this is actually something I use in the woods. I carry it with me when I'm hunting and fishing. They're very affordable, very inexpensive, make great stocking stuffers. He does have bigger knives. This is one of the ones I've shown you multiple times. This is my favorite knife. Like I said, I have others, but this is my go-to for a lot of what I do. And in one of these knives, you're running closer to the $100 mark, but it's definitely well worth it. If you happen to hunt, fish, trap, anything of that nature, talk to him about doing a partial trade. He may deduct some of the money off, especially if it's something unique. So he has got Damascus metal from people that make Damascus steel and done trades that way. As I said before on another episode, he did a trade where he got some beaver tails, and they were tanned out, and he made sheaths with them. And those were some of the most beautiful, unique sheaths I think I've ever seen in my life. And everything he does is so unique and so fascinating, and he can do just about whatever you ask. He ships all over the world. So just because I'm in the South, I'm here in Northwest Florida, doesn't mean he won't ship to you. He ships all over Europe. You name it, that guy has done it. So I ask you to go to his YouTube channel, Wallace Knifeworks, like and subscribe there. I believe that you will definitely enjoy his videos that he puts out. Wonderful content. So I highly suggest that. Speaking of liking and subscribe, please like and subscribe to this channel if you like what you hear. And I will see you next time. So have a great day.